when I was in Taiwan and I had been initiated, I wanted to ask more questions. I didn't know what was going on. I had all these questions. This is just like Freemasons. So I asked one of the senior persons. She said, this is a spiritual question. We'll have to go into the temple. We went into the temple, and the first thing he does was to light 3 candles. I thought, okay, yes, understand. It's the same in Freemasonry. We talk about spiritual thing with the 3 candles. But then what happened was interesting. I was hit by I don't know, like a beam. It wasn't a flash of lightning, but it was like a beam of lightning that went through the left side of my head, through my heart, and down through my left leg. I was just standing there talking to him, and then what happened was that I had an out-of-body experience, rather like in The Matrix, when Keanu Reeves is leaning backwards to avoid all these bullets being shot at him. That's what happened to me, and I divided into 3. One of me grabbed the altar because I was so shocked. What happened? I just clung onto the altar, the edge of the altar. One of me leant backwards like Keanu Reeves, and the third one was watching the other 2. Then it all came back together, 1 second or 2 seconds. And I explained that to my conductor, the person there. He wasn't surprised. He said, these sort of things happen all the time in Taoist temples.
I'm honoured to introduce our distinguished guest, Christopher Earnshaw, a remarkable scholar, Freemason and academic with an extraordinary breadth of expertise. Dr. Earnshaw is a multifaceted intellectual whose achievements span Masonic scholarship, academic research, and professional leadership. As a past Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of Japan and a 33-degree Scottish Rite Mason, he has made significant contributions to Masonic educational efforts, earning the Order of Merit in 2010. With academic credentials including a BA in Japanese and Chinese and a PhD in neuroscience, Dr. Earnshaw brings a unique interdisciplinary perspective. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Dr. Earnshaw is a passionate researcher of Freemasonry origins, as evidenced by his intriguing work exploring the early days of modern speculative Freemasonry. His book, Freemasonry, Initiation by Light, The Secret of the Light in the First Degree, was written to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Fraternity of Freemasonry in London in 1717, and unravels fascinating historical mysteries from secret scrolls to royal connections. Christopher is a man of diverse talents. He rounds out his impressive profile with his love of music, playing the cello as an amateur. Christopher, welcome to the Transcenders podcast.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. The history of secret societies has long fascinated the public, but much remains misunderstood. As a scholar merging neuroscience, spirituality, and esoteric traditions, what first drew you to Freemasonry, and how has your journey evolved from neuroscience to exploring its deeper spiritual dimensions?
I was drawn to it is because my family has a long association with Freemasonry. My father, grandfather, and I believe my great-grandfather was a member of the Grand Lodge of England. It's in my blood. What it has to do with neuroscience, I just see neuroscience as being my job and Freemasonry as being a lifelong interest. So I don't really see connection between the two. But when I dug a little deeper the spiritual aspects of Freemasonry, I did find a connection between the two. That was very enlightening and rewarding.
Freemasonry's roots stretch back to medieval stonemasons' guilds, but its transformation into a philosophical and esoteric order is also a compelling story. Can you walk us through the transition from literal stonemasonry to the Freemasonry we know today?
Yes. I do not believe that there is a direct connection between modern Freemasons, who we call speculative Freemasons, and the people who used to build churches and castles in the medieval times, we refer to as operative Freemasons. What happened was, and this is my theory, but around the end of the 17th century, that would be 1687, to 1688-89, there was a visit to England by a Chinese Mandarin, and this person was a very high status because he's a Mandarin, he's an officer of the Southern Ming court in China. There had been no other Chinese person of that stature in England before, but nobody of the stature of this person. His name is Shen, S-E-H-E-N. He would have been attired in silk. That's standard, and people never saw silk in the 1600s. Very few people had silk, perhaps just the king. But he was dressed from head to toe in silk. He would have had a hat that had ermine on it and probably some gold finial, which is a kind of decoration on the top of the hat. He would have probably had a couple of servants who carried his trunk from the ship when he alighted. This person came at a very interesting time in England because since the introduction of the Blasphemy Act, and the date escapes me, but I think it's 1676, something like that, the church was flexing its muscles. There were many people who were challenging the Blasphemy Act in England. One of the ways they challenged it, they either wrote pamphlets, and pamphleteering was very popular. People would write their opinions on pieces of paper and print them very quickly and either sell them or give them away in the street. This pamphleteering was one way to get your ideas out. There were many people who were writing not just pamphlets, but actually books that questioned the immortality of the soul and whether or not the soul existed. By writing about this, it was seen to be blasphemous. It was even raised in the Houses of Parliament. If a person wrote a book about the existence of the soul, was this blasphemy? This is the time when this Chinese Mandarin arrived. Why it's interesting is because he was a Taoist. In those days, Taoism wasn't defined quite as strictly as it is now. It tended to be a little bit more experiential, and the Taoists were practicing out-of-body experiences. When Shen told this to the people who he met in London, he met people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, Thomas Hyde, who was the professor of Hebrew, but he was also the senior librarian at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. So when he met people like this, and later he actually met the king, they asked him about his country and his religions and things like this. He told them, and they were fascinated that people were practicing out-of-body experiences. And that would prove to somebody that the soul is immortal. If your soul leaves the body and comes back and you don't die in between, this is a phenomenal experience, particularly as everyone was talking about it in London at the time. So what I believe happened is that three people who were very closely associated with Newton and Boyle, they decided to make a society to practice or investigate what the Mandarin Shen had told them. These three people were George Payne, John de Sagoulier, and Anthony Sayer. These three people were the first three Grand Masters of the Premier Grand Lodge in England. Now, what they decided to do, I believe, we don't have a paper trail, and if they did, it would have been exposed a long time ago, but I think what they did is they became members of operative Masonic lodges. You have to step back a little bit to understand the guild system in England at that time. Since the 1400s, the guild system in England ran the economy. So all the major trades had a guild. So if you're a silversmith, goldsmith, a saddler, you could be a fletcher. A fletcher is somebody who puts the feathers on arrows. You could be a chandler, making the harness and the saddle for horses and things like this. They all had their own organizations known as guilds. The laws for the guild were set up by the country. Queen Elizabeth I had set up a law about apprenticeships. Apprenticeship had to be 7 years. The whole structure was very organized. So you would have a guild, for example, like my family comes from Yorkshire. In Yorkshire, they had a special technique for dyeing and weaving striped cloth. They had a special license as a guild to sell that. Other people in the country couldn't sell it. They couldn't make it. They had to have permission or buy it directly from Yorkshire. That is a very structured, and it also stifled growth, I think. This is what the situation was at the time. Masons, meaning stonemasons, were not included as a guild. A guild had a geographical area that it was restricted to. It would sell its products in an open market. The prices were set by the alderman of that town. So the guild couldn't put the prices up suddenly. It just didn't work. So there was no inflation for hundreds of years because the prices were set for everything. The stonemasons, what we called operative masons, had to move around the country to where the work was. You build a church, takes you 15 years. While you were there, you would set up an office, or they called it a lodge, but it's a kind of office for meeting and holding regular meetings. And when a new apprentice come, you would have to teach him things. That's where it was done, at the lodge. The first 3 Grand Masters, and how this came about, I don't know, but I'm speculating myself. They joined these lodges. There was a certain way to join as a member of the gentry. So they were not labourers. They were not blue-collar labourers as we refer to now. These 3 people, de Sagulier, Payne and Sayer, they were what we would call gentry. And that's a level higher on the class structure. Gentry refers to somebody who has a profession and often, not always, but often had a regular wage. Because blue-collar workers didn't have wages. They were paid piecemeal by what the work they did. So if they built a church, they got paid for the amount of weeks that they were involved in building the church. The gentry were different. The gentry would include professors, solicitors, barristers, and doctors, and people like that. These would be known as the gentry. And then above that, you had the aristocracy, and then the nobility and royalty. It was all very organized in those days. First question that comes to mind is, why would 3 educated people decide to join a working classes club or lodge, which is like a working man's lodge? Why would they do that? Why would they involve themselves? They wanted to learn the structure of how it was organized. From there, they used the same terminology as was used by stonemasons. For example, using a compass and squares, a maul and mallets and measuring rules and things like this. They basically took the same structure and they added onto this Chinese hidden secret teaching that they had learnt from Shen. They started their own organization in 1717 and they named it the Premier Grand Lodge.
Were the gentry and the aristocracy responsible for developing the Freemasonry philosophical framework? And Shen's appearance, did that influence its esoteric traditions?
Yes, Shen had already returned to China. The situation in China was there was a large Catholic presence there, particularly Jesuits, Franciscans and Dominicans and perhaps Cluniacs, I'm not sure. But there was a large group there. He had joined a Jesuit church in the south of China near Shanghai, a place called Nanjing, and he had decided he wanted to become part of the priesthood. And the Pope said that people who were not Italians or Europeans were not able to become priests in the land that they lived in because they were, quote, too immature in the faith, whatever that means. Shen had to leave China by boat to go to the Vatican to become a priest. Then he had to make his way back, and it's like a year. Those wooden ships, they don't go very fast, and they had to keep stopping for food and water. So it took about a year just to go there. Unfortunately, he died on the way back in a storm. He died of infection on board. So he never made it back to China. So the year and a half that he was in London, he told Thomas Hyde, the librarian at the Bodleian Library, he told him all about China, everything. They were together for probably about a year, and Thomas Hyde wrote it down. He asked about weights and measures. He asked about the I Ching, because the Bodleian Library had started collecting Chinese documents from about 1610 or 1615, but there was nobody at the university to read them. Nobody could read Chinese. There was no chair for Chinese. At that time, Arabic was the most important foreign language that was used for navigation, for advanced mathematics and things like that. But Chinese was just an unknown factor. When Hyde took Shen to Oxford University, he translated the I Ching and some other documents, and he told him about Taoism, and we know from the letters that they exchanged when Shen was in Portugal on his way to the Vatican. They sent each other letters, and we have these letters at the British Museum, so we understand what was said. But putting it in the context of the history of England at that time, this would have been a very surprising conversation to English people at that time. Yes.
Fascinating. I'm very interested in symbolism and ritual and spiritual alchemy. I see that symbols are the language of Freemasonry, each carrying hidden meanings that transcend simple visual representation. How do Masonic symbols differ from decorative elements, and what deeper principles do they represent?
The symbolism in Masonry is used to teach what we call candidates, people who are joining to become a Mason. To become a Mason, it's a three-step process. It's like attending 3 Shakespearean plays. Like in Shakespeare, the plays are done in the round, so the stage had people, spectators, sitting around on all sides watching the players. This is how Freemasonry is done too. So we have 3 plays, and the candidate is included in the play, but he doesn't know what's going on because he has no reason. We actually, in fact, request that they don't look up Freemasonry before they become initiated and then raised to Master Mason, because there's just so much nonsense on the internet. So we teach them with these different symbols, and these symbols, like a beehive is one of them, and it just shows that Masons should be industrious, work hard, and not lying around and watching television, but like a bee, always active. That's what it means. It's not very deep. The deeper symbolism, from my research, I've found there is a second layer to the ritual we use. The ritual comes in a small book. It's called the Monitor, so you can see what's happening, so you can monitor. We also call it the ritual, and so everything's written in there. It's written in code. So one of the first things a Mason has to do is to learn the code so that he could read the ritual and remember his lines. What I found was, by looking at the Monitor, there is another layer beneath that which is telling of a different story. I had experience with a technique called steganography, probably 15 years ago, a bit more, when I studied Edgar Cayce. Are you familiar with Edgar
Yes,
Cayce?
I am, yeah.
Yes. The sleeping prophet from America. He was a remarkable person, and he was a healer and an educator and a lot of other things. He didn't write a book about it, but some of his pupils put his teachings together into something called the Commentary on the Book of Revelation. Edgar Cayce explains what all the symbolism in the Book of Revelation is and how there is a sub-story. This is what we refer to as steganography. Steganography means that it's got a hidden writing, stegano and graphy. So The writing doesn't use a code or a mark to sheet or special numerology. The secret teaching is hidden below another type of writing. If you see the connection between the two, the second story comes to light. Steganography is often used with images, so like a QR code is a form of steganography.
What role does ritual play in Freemasonry's spiritual journey?
Yes, so ritual is the center of Freemasonry. To be a good ritualist is to be a good Freemason, as people say. However, I don't focus much on the ritual. I think there's more to be learnt. The ritual is important, so the three plays are put on accurately without missing words or mistakes, because the person who is the candidate doesn't know what's going on, and he thinks that every time the play is put on, that is a perfect performance. It's only perfect if our ritual is perfect. Ritual is important not only to teach him, but for also ourselves, to remind ourselves the teachings of Freemasonry. I've been a Mason for 41 years, and it's only after 25 years of repeating the ritual so many times that I suddenly realized that there is more to it than I assumed. It suddenly opened up in front of my eyes, and then suddenly my whole appreciation of Freemasonry changed, and then I started to write my books.
You alluded to the fact that there is a lot of nonsense on the internet about Freemasonry, and I agree. There's more nonsense than common sense on the internet. How has Freemasonry's esoteric dimension been overshadowed in modern interpretations?
So one of the difficulty has been that Freemasons like their secrecy. I don't think of it as secrecy. I think it more as privacy. It's somebody coming up to me and asking what my bank balance is. It's none of your business. Same to Freemasons. What are you Freemasons doing? None of your business. You're not a member. That's how we've always handled it. It's our business. We know what we're doing. We're very happy. And people who have joined, are applied to join, are welcomed, and we don't advertise. So it has been very difficult to grow. It's hard to say. We are 5 million members worldwide, probably 5.5 million members. That's quite a large organization. It's probably bigger than BP. But anyway, so why do people join is probably the question. I think that is to do with they want some more meaningful life. They are not interested by dogma taught to them by the church. The church often cannot defend statements in the Bible. The Bible contradicts itself in so many places. You can say, what about this? He said that. What about this? He says the opposite. The vicar throws his hand up because he doesn't know how to reply to that. He can say is that God moves in mysterious ways. That doesn't work in modern world. So Freemasonry provides many other things in life, like a camaraderie, a great network. Like I used to travel a lot when I was running my pharmaceutical company. I would go to places for the first time, and then if I had any time, I'd look up the Grand Lodge and find out where a meeting was. Then I'd join the meeting, have a convivial conversation, make many friends that way. Yeah, it's a support group. At the same time, we're learning about our spiritual compass, I would say. There's the ritual and so many aspects to it. It's just very interesting.
I want to uncover what I see as a hidden connection in terms of the bridge to Taoism, because Western esoteric traditions, including Freemasonry, have long engaged with Eastern philosophical systems. Taoism, with its emphasis on balance and flow and transformation, I see presents striking parallels to Masonic thought. How did you discover the connection between Taoism and Freemasonry?
Yes, that's actually coincidental. I don't believe in coincidence. I think the world moves a little bit more organized than coincidences. But anyway, at university I studied Japanese and Chinese, and at SOAS, at London University. One of my subjects was ancient Chinese scripts, and we studied Confucius and Mencius. Luckily, we didn't have to do the whole of Confucius and the whole of Mencius, but there were like certain chapters we had to study. I was very taken by Mencius's. Mencius was a pupil of Confucius, but not a direct pupil. He studied with the grandson, I think his name was Zhi, grandson of Confucius. It's 3-4 steps. But he is recognized as being the second Confucius of China. The difference between Mengzi and Confucius, Kongzi, is that Mencius tended to write the same things as Confucius did, who was his indirect master. Confucius wrote them very adroitly. He would put down some teaching he wanted, and it would be 2 lines or 3 lines long. Whereas Mencius, he filled it out with examples taken from history, so you could really understand what Confucius was trying to say. To me, that was very interesting. What Mencius was talking about was so appropriate to modern day life that he had died nearly 4,000 years ago, probably 3,000 years ago. And just surprising that some philosophy from that time was so modern in the way of thinking and the emphasis on education. Education is everything. Because I'd studied Mencius, when a professor of Taoism gave a lecture in Tokyo and I was asking him about Mencius, he invited me to Taiwan, and a temple in Taiwan, it's called the Temple of the Hidden Spirit, it's nice, was having a special event there. I was invited for that. I stayed for 1 week, and while I was there, I took up their offer of being initiated into Taoism. What was a special type of Taoism called Yi Guan Dao, and Yi Guan Dao. Yes, and so when I went to the initiation, I was bowled over because it was the same as Freemasonry. And I just thought, this can't be. Why it's so similar? I mean, I'll just give you a few examples, but in a Masonic lodge, the 3 senior officers, one is the master of the lodge. In the Taoist temple, there are 3 senior officers, and the senior one is known as the light transmitting officer. He transmits the light. It's complicated to explain. I had to write 4 books to explain what light really means, but he transmits light from the Tao, which is the realm of all possibilities, another word for heaven, the realm of all potential. From there, he passes it to the candidate. That's what the master does in Freemasonry. That's his job as well. Exactly the same. He takes the light from the east and brings it to the candidate. The other 2 officers, one represented the sun and one represented the moon, and same in Freemasonry, the senior and junior wardens, they represent the sun and the moon. There were just so many. I thought, no, how come other people aren't talking about this? How come I'm the first person to recognize this? I looked at it, and then I found out that the Freemasons have, of course, in the ritual, there are 3 things that they teach the candidate: how to recognize people by handshakes and signs and words. The Chinese do the same, and they call them the 3 treasures in China. There's a special word and signs that they make so everybody knows each other. And it just went on, and I found 28 of these coincidences between Freemasonry and Taoism, which included not just the ritual of both organizations, but also the temple and the Freemasons' temple or lodge and the Taoist temple between the 2. So 28 is outside the realm of coincidence. The bottom line is that Taoism teaches that the soul is immortal and you can experience this immortality without dying. They talk about this in Freemasonry in the 3rd degree, but nobody has put 2 and 2 together to realize what that is all about. That's the interesting thing.
Very interesting, yes. What key Taoist principles are reflected in Masonic teachings, and how do these intersections challenge conventional understandings of Freemasonry's origins?
Yes, they don't have a form of dogma to believe in, like in Catholicism or Protestantism. They base their belief around the I Ching and the 3 books of Mencius, Confucius, and Chuang Tzu. This forms the center of their belief. It isn't a belief based on a god and angels and saints, but based on philosophy. They carry this philosophy into their everyday living, the way they live and the food that they eat and how they work, all have a very simple structure which is supported by this philosophy. People sometimes call Taoism a religio-philosophy. It isn't really a religion, it's more a philosophy of life. We can say the same thing about Freemasonry. It isn't a religion, it's a way of life. In fact, a philosophy of life, just like Taoism. And I think that's probably the correspondence that you're referring to.
In terms of belief, I think it's knowledge and wisdom more than belief, because you only have belief where there is an absence of knowledge and there's an absence of wisdom. If those teachings are based in knowledge and wisdom, that's something that organizes and propels your faculty, your thinking and your trajectory.
Yes, I would say the two organizations are basically 95% the same, but there is a slight difference that Taoism came out of the roots of feudal struggles against the Qing dynasty. When Shen, the Mandarin, left Shanghai area to come to Europe, the Ming dynasty was holed up in a temple in South China, and they were being attacked by the Manchurians who had come through the Great Wall of China. They had breached it, and slowly they were taking over the country. It took them 8 years to overthrow the whole of China. That's how big China is. It's a big place. And in the interim, Shen made his escape, but he did intend to return, which is quite brave. There's a painting of him in the royal collection at Windsor Castle. So we know what he looked like, and we can see that he had cut his hair. Now, the ancient Chinese, meaning Ming dynasty and going before, for example, the Tang dynasty and Song dynasty, the Chinese men never cut their hair. They put it up in a bun on top of their head. So to cut their hair was to show that they had facience to the new rulers. In the royal collection at Windsor Castle, you can see that Shen has had to cut his hair off, and he now has a ponytail, and this is a sign of accepting the new overlords. Taoism was based on the rebellion of farmers and fishermen in the south. Not just the new Qing dynasty, but also the Ming dynasty were pretty cruel on these people and taking taxes from them. Whereas in England, Freemasonry was an organization for nobility. They didn't expect fishermen and farmers to become members. In fact, in London, you have to backtrack. There's so much history that you have to explain why stuff happens. But in those days, early 1700s, the House of Stuart was run by Catholics. King James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II. These were Catholics, but the country was Protestant. That made it really quite difficult for them. There were all sorts of uprisings like the Gordon riots, things like this. There was a second element. The Catholic Scots would come down to London to try and overthrow the Hanoverian King George I and replace the Protestant with a Catholic king. This had been going on for some 50 years. There have been many attempts. The last attempt, Freemasonry, started in 1717. 1716, the Scots came down as far as Preston. It was quite an effort, but they were repelled by King George's army. Then it came down several other times. There were attempts coming from Europe and with Spanish, because the whole of Europe was Catholic. Scotland, Ireland, Spain, France, the Spanish Netherlands, these were all Catholic countries, and Protestant England was a little circle in the middle, fending off these people coming from all sides. And you know the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his father, the Old Pretender. These two, King James and his son Charles Stuart, they wanted to keep the fires burning in Scotland, not just Scotland but Ireland, and replace this Hanoverian king. So Freemasonry was very concerned about Jacobites who may be spies trying to join. Secondly, there was still the Inquisition in England at that time. The Inquisition wasn't abolished until 1870-something. So this is 1717, so 150 years Inquisition was still active in England. There were all these threats to the nascent Freemason organization. They got their support from the nobility and from aristocracy, whereas Taoists were the other way around. They got them from the lower classes, and they used all these secret signs that are still used in Freemasonry to identify each other. If you were a peddler or a traveling monk in China somewhere and you passed another person in the road, you don't know if he's friend or foe. But if you made this certain sign, then he would leave you in peace. This is a sign that we still use in Freemasonry now. Even though the concept of this philosophical base of life are similar for the two organizations, Freemasons, de Saint-Goulier and Payne and Sayer, they wanted to be part of the upper echelons. One of the reasons I believe they were so motivated is because their salaries were dependent on rich people. In those days, if you were a doctor, there was no insurance, so you'd only get paid when somebody came round to see you for some tincture of laudanum or whatever you were giving away. So it's very difficult to have a quality lifestyle. The more people who are rich that you know, the better life is. I think that was one of the prime motivators for starting Freemasonry in those times, and they actually said in the constitutions that they wanted to have a noble brother as their Grand Master. That stated their objective. They had 4 gentry, the first 3 Grand Masters, then the next person was the Duke of Montague. From the Duke of Montague, there were some very challenged Grand Masters, but by about 1760, by then the Prince of Wales became the second Royal Grand Master. Since then, we've had lots of Royal Grand Masters. So that made the Freemasons untouchable, so to speak. Because, you see, the thing was that people like the Prime Minister Walpole, he introduced 2 laws to make joining a secret society a punishable act. The second one was to join any organization that required a secret oath upon the candidate. But those 2 things both covered Freemasonry. The reason that the Freemasonry was excluded from the law is because we had so many very high-standing princes and dukes, also the Prince of Wales, as Grand Masters. We were protected.
There's a lot of history to understand some of the key things that you're going through. I appreciate you giving us some insight into that. I want to cover astral projection and the esoteric path. I've read some scholars suggest that Freemasons practiced astral projection and internal alchemy, which I see draws parallels to Taoist spiritual practices. What historical evidence suggests early Freemasons practiced astral projection, and how do these esoteric practices align with Taoist techniques?
That's a multifaceted question. But firstly, I think there was a lot of interest in alchemy in the early days because we have alchemical references in our ritual, which unfortunately many modern brethren don't recognize at all. There was that interest, that's why the references were included. I don't think out-of-body experiences or astral travel was understood or practiced by early Freemasons. I don't think so. I think they recognized it as a viable way to prove that the soul was immortal, but I doubt that it really caught on very much. There is one reference. What happened in the 1740s, there were many Scots in London who were labourers, painters, decorators, things like this, and they were excluded from Freemasonry because they were thought they could be Jacobites. You know, they're Catholics, they're Scots. Everybody who was anybody was a Protestant. It's actually referred to in the literature that some operative Masons were excluded from a lodge under the Premier Grand Lodge. So there was a bit of tension there, I'm sure. But what happened was that after a while, all these labourers got together and formed their own structure of lodges, and in 1751, they started their own Grand Lodge called the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, and by then the Premier Grand Lodge had changed its name to the Grand Lodge of England, and there was a lot of tension between the two. I don't think there was outright fighting, but they were not friendly to each other. But they both had very similar rituals. The Scots had taken the Premier Grand Lodge's ritual and added things to it. But it's interesting, they reported once that they knew the secret of invisibility. Now, becoming invisible, it's a stretch of the imagination even nowadays. But if you think of out-of-body experience, it's a form of invisibility because you are flying or moving around, nobody can see you. It's just your spiritual or astral essence that is moving around. Your body is asleep in bed. This could be a form of invisibility, and it seems that it wasn't the Grand Lodge of England, but the Grand Lodge of the Ancients who were practicing this. Maybe there's not much truth in it. It's hard to know in those days that people said a lot of strange things. I just don't think that it was a common practice. There may have been interest in alchemy. I know the actual alchemy. Isaac Newton was practicing alchemy. Boyle was practicing alchemy until the 1740s, which is 20 years after Freemasonry was established. So alchemy is a real thing, but I don't think that they were successful. I think their objective was to make gold, and not a spiritual alchemy, but actually transmuting lead to gold, which is nearly impossible. Not exactly impossible, but nearly impossible.
Why do you think this dimension of Freemasonry has largely been forgotten?
So what happened was near the end of the 18th century, sometime we had all this problem with Horace Walpole, who was the Prime Minister. There was a bit of tension there. And suddenly in 1821, I think it was, Francois Champollion, he deciphered the Rosetta Stone. So suddenly all those hieroglyphics that had been found during the Napoleonic campaign to Egypt, suddenly people could read those. So instead of China being the flavor of the day, it was Egypt. This started something called Egyptomania, and people started looking away from China and towards Egypt. Later, Queen Victoria became the Empress of India, and there's all this big boom in Indian things. So if you go to London and look in antique shops, you will see lots of these three things: Egyptian, Indian and Chinese things, pottery or ornaments in these shops, because this is the period that we went through. Particularly China is interesting because it was over 100 years long, this Chinese boom in England. It coincided with Masonry and the Mandarin Shen and things like this. I don't think it's a coincidence.
In terms of the modern evolution in this digital age, many decentralized organizations are emerging as a new form of collective governance. Do you think they represent a modern continuation of Masonic principles?
The Masonic principles is a difficult one because at the time of Victoria, Victorian people were very strict on moral codes and doing things correctly and be church-going and be seen as being an upright member of society. So Freemasonry also changed. It became a moral education, and we now call it a peculiar form of morality. It's not peculiar, but that's the word we use. Previous to that, I believe it was a spiritual understanding from 1717 to about 1780, perhaps. By that time, people had forgotten the objective, what it was all about, because nothing was written down. Most of it was word from mouth to mouth. Then it became a moral teaching. Also, it became less Christian, and I wouldn't say polytheist, but open to other religions. Because of many Englishmen in the army, particularly officers in the army who were Masons, or they may have been Masons. They went to India and they met many Indian aristocrats. These Indians also joined Freemasonry. So we had many people coming from the so-called colonies, coming back to England as members, as Freemasons. So now we have not only many languages in lodges, but we also have many basic belief structures. Instead of just having the Bible, we had to include the Vedas and Tao Te Ching and Zoroastrian. And so the more enlightened lodges nowadays have all these core belief systems, books, all of them on the altar. We can allow any person of any faith to become a Freemason, which it wasn't like that in the 1700s. It was very English and aristocratic and noble meaning open for nobility to join. It wasn't open to working class people, wasn't open to Muslims or Jews. But since those days, it has changed, yes. I don't think it's become a template for enlightened government. That's what the Americans thought when they left to go to America, and they took all these Masonic ideals with them. In America, this is because of, in the late 1780s, there was the War of Independence. In America, we call it the Revolutionary War, but they have a different way of thinking about it. Many of the British soldiers that went to America were also supported by French soldiers. So the French had their own ideas about enlightenment, and then we had the French Revolution, 1789. So all these changes were happening. It's a very exciting time. But the Americans believed that they could make a Masonic society based on, and that's why Washington, D.C., looked at from the sky, you can see so many Masonic symbols in the street structures. You can see the square and compasses and many other things.
Weren't there 55 or so signatories to Masons to the Constitution in 1789?
Maybe, yes, there were some 55, but I don't think they were all Masons. Probably half were Masons. From that time until Gerald Ford, most of the presidents of the United States have been Freemasons. Gerald Ford was the last one.
In the period we're in now of accelerated evolution, how might modern technology revive esoteric brotherhoods in new ways?
It's a challenge that we're talking about. A recent magazine I received, and I think I've got it here, it's a Scottish Rite Journal. In the bottom it says, the journal looks at AI and how AI could be used. We're not indifferent to modern things, but I think we're a little bit conservative. I think the way you learnt it is the way you want to teach it. You don't want other people to make shortcuts or leave out things. That's one of the reasons that Freemasonry hasn't changed over the last 300 years, because we are all repeating what our fathers taught us, and we teach the candidate or our children, and it has to be exactly correct and exactly the same thing. Changing that by bringing in other technology, perhaps it won't. There are places it'll work for communication and things like that, of course. One of the things we do is look after our brothers in case of health problems or financial problems, and we know to help the brothers. So in that case, communication, mobile phones are very important. But in a lodge per se, I don't think they would add anything. Having a hologram in the middle of the floor won't make any difference, because it's all in the mind's eye. What you're seeing is being explained to you, but you're basically in an empty room, but people are telling you, you're now entering King Solomon's temple, and we will enter from the south gate. So in your mind, you've got this imagination of what King Solomon's temple would look like. You can't replace that with holograms or whatever, digital experiences. It wouldn't work.
In terms of your personal journey, and if you were to reflect, because I see every Mason's path is a deeply personal journey of transformation or spiritual transformation, and it's shaped by experiences and cultural contexts. How has living in Japan influenced your understanding of both Freemasonry and Taoism? Have there been any personal transformations that you've experienced through engaging with both traditions?
First of all, we don't have Taoism in Japan. It's not a Japanese thing, it's Chinese. You don't even find it very much in mainland China. The places you'll find it, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and to some extent Singapore and places like that, but not in mainland China or Japan. How has Freemasonry changed me? It changed me because I became aware of this hidden teaching. We call it a system of morality. But the more I looked at it, it isn't a system of morality. It's a spiritual awakening. It isn't explained to you properly. You probably wouldn't get that spiritual awakening. I can share an interesting experience I had in Taiwan. When the ritual starts in Freemasonry, the first thing happens is to write 3 candles are lit, and no work, spiritual work or any Freemason ritual can be done without 3 candles being lit. Afterwards everything happens, and at the end of the ceremony we close the lodge, and the last thing is to put out the 3 candles. When I was in Taiwan and I had been initiated, I wanted to ask more questions. I didn't know what was going on. I had all these questions. This is just like Freemasons. So I asked one of the senior persons. She said, this is a spiritual question. We'll have to go into the temple. We went into the temple, and the first thing he does was to light 3 candles. I thought, okay, yes, understand. It's the same in Freemason. We talk about spiritual thing with the 3 candles. But then what happened was interesting. I was hit by I don't know, like a beam. It wasn't a flash of lightning, but it was like a beam of lightning that went through the left side of my head, through my heart, and down through my left leg. I was just standing there talking to him, and then what happened was that I had an out-of-body experience, rather like in The Matrix, when Keanu Reeves is leaning backwards to avoid all these bullets being shot at him. That's what happened to me, and I divided into 3. One of me grabbed the altar because I was so shocked. What happened? I just clung onto the altar, the edge of the altar. One of me leant backwards like Keanu Reeves, and the third one was watching the other 2. Then it all came back together, 1 second or 2 seconds. And I explained that to my conductor, the person there. He wasn't surprised. He said, these sort of things happen all the time in Taoist temples. So I asked him, what is the meaning of it? So he says, why should things have meaning? It's an experience. So he thought perhaps that my heart was being trained for some greater work or something. I'm not quite sure, but for me it was quite an exciting experience. I don't think this happens in Freemasonry. One of the sad things about Freemasonry is that people do not take the lodge as being, I wouldn't say sacred, but a special place. When we enter a lodge, we always wear white gloves. In Taoism, they wash their hands with wet towels. This is to get rid of the negative energy they may bring into the lodge. We're wearing white gloves. It's a kind of compromise for Europeans. But people come into the lodge and they're laughing and joking around. They wouldn't do that in a church. In the lodge, we have a canteen area and a dining area. That's where we should be joking around and talking and taking photographs. But in the lodge, it should be a quiet, solemn place for decorum and structure and quiet meditation. This has been lost, but in Taoism, they still respect their temples in the way they've always done, that it's a special place.
When I was practicing Aikido, and we had people come from Japan who were masters, and there's an element of respect in the dojo. When you walk into the dojo, it's the environment dictates that. When these Japanese masters came over, they were so humble, really powerful men in terms of their art and their craft, but the way they would approach you was so respectful. It made me realize how disrespectful we are in society to each other.
When you've reached the top, you don't have to prove anything. People in the West are always trying to prove something. This is why we have this problem with celebrities, because they're always trying to prove something. They're always trying to make more money. Whereas, as you say, somebody who's at the top of his league in Aikido, for example, they don't have to prove it. You challenge them, they will show you.
Oh, they will show you, definitely.
Yeah, the game, yeah. I did Aikido for nearly 3 years. I have a black belt in Aikido, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
There's an art and a flow to it. I see it's based on physics. What they did was so effortless. Even my sensei, who was 82, he could put me on the ground, and he would tell the other Aikidoists, in the dojo, saying, don't treat him like a jungle gym. Don't try and climb all over him and force him, because you won't win.
Yeah, if you try to use power, you won't win.
I see that Freemasonry is facing an evolving world, as we all are. What does Freemasonry need to do to stay relevant in today's world?
This is the question, isn't it? In England, we are losing 100 lodges every year, closing down, or some joining other lodges. A lot of history is lost because of that. But we have still 12,000 lodges in England. We've got a long way to go. But where it's really growing is in the Far East and places like India, the Philippines, Brazil. I did a podcast on Brazil. I have a podcast called, and if your listeners are interested, called Freemasonry in 7 minutes or less. And I looked at the success of Brazil. It's like every other person is a Freemason in Brazil. They even have a town which is based on the ideal Freemason society. All the decorations and lampposts and everything have squares and compasses on them. It is very popular down there. Why is that so different to what we are doing in England? It's hard to say. I think people in these countries feel that being part of Freemasonry is a way to advance in society. We no longer believe this in the West. Many people in the West believe that Freemasonry is an old man's club. We have lots of young people joining all the time, but that is the perception. But what to do in the future, and this has been my life work in Freemasonry, is education. We have to include more organized education. If you want to, we say go through the chairs, but if you want to climb the ladder of Freemasonry, you have to do it through exams. So there would be an exam for every step, and at the moment there is no exam. A lot of it is done on, oh, he's a friend of mine, or let's give him the position, or something like that. Somebody who joined 15 years earlier is sidelined for somebody who joined 2 years ago because he's a friend of the master. So to get rid of this idea, we have to have people who are elected because they are the best educated in Freemasonry and not because they're somebody's best friend.
Beautiful. And that's what your books are about.
Books are about it. I was chairman of the education committee in Scottish Rite for many years. I've been lecturing for many years, and I keep saying the same thing. Hopefully one year I will find a Grand Master who believes in what I'm saying, and he implements some new way of going through the ranks in Freemasonry, because sometimes we have even Grand Masters who know nothing about Freemasonry. It's sad. I met a Grand Master, and he was pointing in Japan. We are very lucky. We own a lot of land, and we have 2 high-rise buildings on our land. The Grand Master, who will remain anonymous, pointed at one of the buildings. He said, I felt so proud that our ancestors used to build buildings like this. I said, you don't know what he's talking about. That is operative Freemasonry. Modern Freemasons are speculative. We're speculating on the soul and the meaning of life. And it was just sad that he didn't know the difference. And
in your view, how can Freemasonry's spiritual dimensions contribute to global unity and transformation?
That's the other part of the third degree ritual that people, I don't know if I've understood it correctly, but in my understanding, which I wrote about in my books, is that it's to teach a technique about a very high quality spiritual experience, which is called astral travel, or the out-of-body experience. When you experience this, your body is asleep in bed or where you left it, and you are floating through the universe, and initially you start off, which you have a kind of shadowy outline of your original body, but the deeper you go into the universe, and it's just non-stop, it's just one thing after another, it's phenomenal, you lose all that sense of a body and you become a speck of light. That speck of light has no creed, no color, no sex, no age, nothing. We're all the same when you come to that speck of light. You meet another speck of light, and it's the consciousness of a human being. You can communicate, but you can't make a differentiation. You can't take a prejudicial point of view because it's just a speck of light. This is how studying these advanced spiritual techniques will at last start bringing people to their senses that we are all just specks of light. We're all souls having a physical experience in this world. And one day we will die, but then we will come back. Death is an illusion. It's like walking into another room. Once you understand, once you've experienced it, and then you come back again, you keep going until your soul has been educated and rid of all its bad tendencies, then you will start reincarnating. The way Freemasonry can help change the world's attitudes.
It makes me think of how different the world could be if we absorbed and reflected that particular aspect of ourselves, that we are a speck of light. I think Carl Sagan said, we are stardust. If this can be the stardust of our understanding, that would be a great thing.
Yes, it's like your Aikido master. He's got to a level where he is confident in who he is, and he doesn't have to prove himself. If you do astral travel, you will change. You will realize that I don't have to prove myself to anybody. I am perfect as I am. I'm just on this earth to have a physical experience, and I will go back to Stardust or Ziggy Stardust or whatever it is. That's the reality. We've lost this understanding of spiritualism, what spiritual world means. And I'm a part-time dowser, so I also do exorcisms for people. I deal with the spiritual world all the time, so I'm already fairly well understand the situation.
What advice would you give to someone interested in Freemasonry's esoteric aspects?
I'd hope they'd read my books, because my books are all about the esoterica, but based on the history, not just strange words taken out of like transubstantiation or some of these big words. No, I put it into the history and on why these situations happened and what it was all about, why things developed they did. So if there are other people who've written books, but my book leads you through the alchemy and the spiritual, and finally to this Chinese spiritual practice. So if you wanted to study at home, this would be a great way. If you wanted to join a lodge, just call a Grand Lodge close to you and ask for an introduction to a lodge.
What's the book you would recommend? Have you got a copy of it there?
Yeah, sure. The first book in the series. So there's one book for each degree. We have 3 degrees plus one higher degree. It's called Initiation by Light. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I see that.
And so this initiation is what I started mentioning. When the master brings light from the east to the candidate, this starts the initiation. It starts the soul opening up to spiritual things. And the Chinese do the same thing, the Taoist anyway. That would be a good place to start.
What's been the most surprising discovery in your research on Freemasonry and spirituality?
So many. I just suddenly realized why we were doing things. We were doing things in the lodge. It seemed to have a meaning, and then suddenly I found a second meaning, and then made much more sense. If I was talking to a Mason, it'd be easy to explain, but it's not so easy for the general population. But there are many examples in my books of what the real meaning of these things are. And they tie it in with the Bible. There are so many biblical references in Freemasonry. So it makes you start to appreciate or start challenging some of the beliefs that you have acquired from religion.
So what's next for you? Are there any upcoming projects or books we can look forward to?
Yes, I have 2 more books coming out in the series. There are now 5. So the 3 degrees in Freemasonry, there's a book for each one. Then there's a book at the end about spiritual practices for Freemasons, to find that lost connection that we used to have, but we don't have now. I started a spiritual school in Tokyo that is growing very fast and very well. I've learnt from my experiences. I'm now teaching to Japanese people. They seem to be loving it.
And that's fantastic. I love that. Where can people find you, Christopher, and where can people find out more about the work that you do?
As I said, I'm an exorcist, but normally I don't advertise it. My friends know I am, and if they have problems with people or issues, they come and see me. I can change the energy for them. My website is chris-earnshaw.com. You can read about my books there. I'm on Twitter, Threads, and my podcast. Also on YouTube, I have some 78 short videos I've made that explain certain aspects of Freemasonry.
Is that under your name?
No, it's under it's Spiritual Freemasonry.
Okay.
My books, as a group, they're known as Spiritual Freemasonry because I believe Freemasonry is a spiritual education, not a moral education. That's why I use the word spiritual.
Today's conversation with you has been an enlightening journey. I know we've only skimmed the surface. There are multiple layers. It's been an enlightening journey through the hidden connections between Freemasonry and touched on Taoism. And you've provided fascinating insights into how Taoist principles, I think we called it in Aikido Wu Wei, effortless action, and the balance of
effortless action.
Effortless action, yeah, and the balance of yin, yang. We've examined the historical backdrop of 18th century Europe.
For example, in the lodge, and this applies to every lodge, there are two symbols in the lodge. One represents Confucius and the other one Taoism. Nobody would recognize them unless it was explained to them. It's sitting there in front of you. They're in the middle of the lodge, and this is every lodge in the world. They all have these symbols, but people don't know how to interpret them or to read them. My books, I've got books on alchemy and Freemasonry and all sorts of things.
I want to thank you for sharing your research, your wisdom, and your passion for uncovering the hidden connections between East and West. And I hope the audience will walk away with a newfound appreciation for the depth of both Freemasonry and Taoism, especially once they purchase your books and do a deeper dive into these things. I really look forward to seeing what's next in your journey.
Just today, I completed the editing of my Japanese language books on Freemasonry. It's the same 4 books are going to be translated. I just finished the first one, and I sent it to Amazon today to be made into a book.
Fantastic.
That'll be ready for the Japanese brethren. The next step is going to be Brazilian Portuguese. I've already translated the book. I'm waiting just for somebody to, what we call native check. After that, I'm making a Chinese one.
Get the word out.
It's the only language out there, yeah?
Do you have any passing words at all, Christopher?
You want less than 500, let me think. Life is part of the spiritual world, and we're interdependent. What you learn in Bible school and things like this are all silly little stories. They don't help with your spiritual growth. We are so close to Spirit. Spirit's there all the time. If you need the help of an angel, you just have to call out. That's the angel's job, is to help us. In Freemasonry, we call this the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. That's what we refer to. This fatherhood of God is we're the children of God. He wants the best for us, like anyone, any father for a child. We need to grow and grow spiritually, I believe. And it's a challenge, but it's very exciting too. Nice talking to you, Peter.
And to you, Christopher. Have a lovely evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.